Welcome to the story of the disappearance on Regent Street. I am your host, Holmes's friend, Dr. Watson. Thank you for joining me on another journey, but before we start, let me know from which city are you watching from, and what was the first Sherlock Holmes story you ever heard about. Chapter 1, A Lady Under Restraint. It has been my habit, in the long years of my association with Sherlock Holmes, to open each account of his cases with some remark upon the season, or upon my friend's temperament at the moment the affair began, as though the weather and the detective were forces of equal consequence in the shaping of events. I confess the habit freely, for it is an honest one. In the case of Alfred Carroway's disappearance, which the evening papers would soon call the most sensational vanishing since Spring Heeled Jack, I can say with certainty that the season and the man were for once in perfect accord, both dark, both restless, and both waiting for something to burn. It was the evening of Thursday, the 14th of November, 1895. A bitter fog had rolled up from the river and pressed itself against the windows of 221B Baker Street, like a grey hand laid upon glass. The fire in the grate was well built, but fighting a losing war against the damp, and the lamps had been lit since 4 o'clock. I sat in my customary chair with a medical journal open on my knee, though I confess I had read the same paragraph on carbolic irrigation 3 times without absorbing a word of it. My attention was elsewhere, specifically upon Holmes. He stood at the chemical table beneath the window, in shirt sleeves and waistcoat, his long fingers moving among a row of labelled glass dishes, with the absorbed delicacy of a man tuning a violin. Before him lay a half-dozen small mounds of powder and ash arranged on squares of white card. His lens was propped against a retort stand. A notebook lay open beside his elbow, filled with his sharp, angular script. "You are cataloguing ashes again," I ventured. "Street residues, Watson. Not merely ashes, though ash forms the greater portion. I am engaged in what I believe may become a monograph of some modest utility, a district-by-district classification of the soils, powders, and particulate deposits one may gather from the pavements and gutters of London. Each neighbourhood leaves its signature. Southwark smells of tallow and malt, Bermondsey reeks of the tanneries, and this—" He lifted one of the dishes and held it beneath his aquiline nose, inhaling with the sharp concentration of a sommelier. "This is unmistakably Cheapside. Printer's ink, horse dung from the omnibus stands, and the faintest trace of roasted coffee from the merchant houses near Poultry." "A parlour trick," I said, though I smiled. "A tool," he corrected, setting the dish down. "The day will come, Watson, when a man's boot will betray him more surely than his tongue. A grain of chalk upon a heel, a smudge of clay from a particular embankment. London is not one city, it is 100, each with its own dust." He paused, then added with a thin note of melancholy, "It is also, at present, appallingly dull." I knew that tone. It was the tone that preceded Black Moods, erratic violin performances at 3 in the morning, and, in darker periods, the Morocco case. I had learned over years that the best antidote was not argument but distraction, and I was casting about for a suitable topic when fate, in the person of Mrs. Hudson, intervened. Our landlady appeared at the door with an expression that combined professional propriety with undisguised curiosity. "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes. She would not give her name, but she arrived in a private carriage, and she is, if I may say, in some distress." Holmes's eyes sharpened at once. The ash dishes were forgotten. He reached for his frock coat, shrugged it on with a single fluid movement, and nodded. "Show her up, Mrs. Hudson, and perhaps a pot of tea. Strong, with sugar. Distress and the cold are poor companions." The woman who entered our sitting room a moment later was perhaps 40 years of age, handsome rather than beautiful, dressed in a dark green travelling costume of evident quality. Her gloves were buttoned to the wrist. Her hat was pinned with precision. She carried herself with the composed bearing of a woman accustomed to being observed in drawing rooms and found adequate. And yet, beneath that composure, something was wound very tight indeed. I saw it in the stillness of her hands, which did not tremble but were held deliberately, consciously still, as though she had forbidden them to shake. "Pray sit down, madam," said Holmes, indicating the basket chair nearest the fire. "You have had a difficult journey from, I should say, somewhere in the region of Kensington, and you have not eaten since this morning." She paused, half-seated, and stared at him. "How could you possibly? The mud upon the hem of your coat is the yellowish variety particular to the Kensington roads, after their recent resurfacing, and you carry no crumbs upon your gloves nor any trace of tea upon your lips, though the hour is past 6, and any woman of your evident regularity would ordinarily have taken refreshment by now. But these are trifles. Please, sit. Tell me what has brought you here." She sat. She folded her hands in her lap with that same deliberate stillness. "My name is Eleanor Carroway," she said. "My husband is Alfred Carroway, senior partner of Carroway and Weatherby Investments in Threadneedle Street. This afternoon, at approximately 2:30, my husband vanished from Regent Street in broad daylight. He has not been seen since." I leaned forward in my chair. Holmes did not move, but his grey eyes had taken on that peculiar fixity of attention which I had come to recognise as the outward sign of an inward engine beginning to turn. "Vanished?" Holmes repeated, as though tasting the word. "Pray be precise, Mrs. Carroway. What do you mean by vanished?" "I mean precisely what I say, Mr. Holmes. My husband entered Whitmore and Crane, the watchmaker on Regent Street, shortly after 2:00 to collect a pocket watch he had left for repair. He was seen to emerge from the shop at approximately 25 minutes to 3. He stood upon the pavement. Several witnesses observed him. A delivery wagon passed along the street, and when it had gone, he was no longer there. No one saw him step into a cab. No one saw him enter another shop. And no one saw him fall, or cry out, or struggle. He was simply gone. The room was silent, save for the hiss of the coal fire and the muffled rumble of a hansom passing below. "Inspector Lestrade has been informed," she continued, her voice level but thin, as though she were reading from a prepared text, and feared that any deviation would cost her the whole performance. "He believes my husband has been kidnapped. There was a chestnut vendor nearby, a common-looking man with a brazier cart, who has also since disappeared. Lestrade believes the two events are connected." "And what do you believe, Mrs. Carroway?" It was the sort of question Holmes asked when he already suspected the answer would be more instructive than any fact. She hesitated. It was very brief, less than a second, but I saw it, and I knew Holmes had seen it. "I must know what has happened," she said. "Not I fear he is dead. Not I am terrified." I noted the phrasing even then, though I did not understand its significance until much later. Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "3 questions, Mrs. Carroway, before we proceed. First, was your husband carrying anything of value when he left Baker Street this morning?" "His watch, the one he collected. And his wallet, I presume. He's not a man who carries large sums upon his person." "Second, had he been anxious of late, distracted, sleeping poorly?" Again the brief hesitation. "He has been tense these past several weeks. He has not confided the cause. Alfred is not a man who shares his burdens readily, but I've heard him moving about the house at odd hours, and twice I have found the lamp lit in his study well past midnight. And third, why Regent Street? Is it his custom to visit that particular district during the working day?" "Not especially. He mentioned the watch repair some days ago. He was, a man of precise habits. A repaired watch left uncollected would have troubled him. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the mantelpiece, where he stood for a long moment with his back to us, gazing into the fire. When he turned, his expression was unreadable. "I shall look into the matter, Mrs. Carroway. You were right to come to me, rather than rely solely upon Scotland Yard, though I am sure Lestrade will pursue the case with his customary energy. I shall require access to your husband's study and his personal effects. Watson," he glanced at me, "clear your morning." She thanked him with a dignity that bordered on the mechanical. At the door she paused, and for the first time something cracked in the careful surface. Not tears, but a fleeting look of bewildered exhaustion, as though the sheer impossibility of the day had only now begun to register. "Mr. Holmes," she said quietly, "I do not know whether my husband is alive or dead, but I know that something has been wrong for a long time, longer than today. I felt it. I simply could not name it." And then she was gone, her footsteps receding down the stairs, the front door opening and closing, the carriage pulling away into the fog. I sat back in my chair. "Poor woman," I said. "She bore herself remarkably well." "Remarkably," Holmes agreed, but his tone carried a note of something that was not quite admiration. He returned to the mantelpiece and took up his pipe, filling it slowly from the Persian slipper. "She bore herself with the composure of a woman who has been expecting disaster, Watson, though perhaps not this particular variety of it. There is fear there, certainly, but not surprise in its purest form. She is frightened, yes, but she is not astonished." "You think she knows something?" "I think she suspects something financial, something ruinous, and has suspected it for some time. But the mechanism of today's events has genuinely bewildered her. She came here not to discover whether her husband is alive, but to discover what he has done." I stared at him. "Holmes, you cannot mean to suggest—" "I suggest nothing, as yet. The facts are insufficient. But I will say this, Watson." He struck a match and held it to the bowl of his pipe, and in the flare of that small light his face was hawkish and intent. "A man who vanishes in London must either possess wings or an accomplice." He shook out the match and dropped it into the grate. "We shall see which it is tomorrow morning. Regent Street, I think, at first light, and bring your revolver. Not because I expect violence, but because the fog is thick, the streets are dark, and I have learned that the cases which begin with impossible disappearances rarely end with simple explanations." I did as he asked. I cleared my morning. I loaded my revolver and set it upon the nightstand. And as I lay in bed that night, listening to the distant scrape of Holmes's violin drifting down through the floorboards, a slow, brooding passage in a minor key, I found myself turning Mrs. Carroway's words over and over in my mind. I must know what has happened, not find him, not save him. I must know what has happened. It was, I thought, an extraordinary thing for a wife to say, but then it was already proving to be an extraordinary case. Chapter 2. The Ashes on the Pavement Weir 2. The Ashes on the Pavement. We arrived at Regent Street shortly after 9 o'clock on the morning of Friday, the 15th of November. The fog had not lifted, but merely thinned, exchanging the dense suffocation of the previous night for a pale, luminous haze that turned the gas lamps into smeared halos and gave the facades of the great shops a quality of uncertain distance. The street was already alive with trade, delivery carts and private carriages jostling for position, shop boys sweeping steps. Holmes had said little during the cab ride. He sat with his chin upon his chest and his eyes half closed, and I had learned long ago that this posture indicated not drowsiness, but intense internal activity, the rapid sorting and discarding of hypotheses before the evidence had even been touched. When we stepped down from the hansom opposite Whitmore and Crane, however, he became a different creature entirely, alert, physical, precise, moving with the contained energy of a hound released onto a scent. "The watchmaker first," he said, "then the pavement." Whitmore and Crane occupied a narrow but elegantly appointed shop front. The interior was hushed and lamplit, lined with glass cabinets displaying pocket watches and carriage clocks of every description. Behind the counter stood a bespectacled man of 60 or so, whom Holmes addressed without preamble. "You are Mr. Whitmore?" "Crane, sir. Mr. Whitmore has been dead these 11 years. I am Frederick Crane." "My name is Sherlock Holmes. I am inquiring into the disappearance of Mr. Alfred Carroway, who I understand collected a watch from your premises yesterday afternoon." Crane's face, already pale by nature and profession, became a shade paler still. "A dreadful business, Mr. Holmes. Yes, Mr. Carroway came in at 2:15 or thereabouts. He had left a pocket watch for cleaning and adjustment of the escapement, a very fine piece, Breguet, open-faced with an enamel dial. He was most particular about it." "Describe his manner." Crane considered this with the careful attention of a man accustomed to precision. "He was calm, sir, quite calm. I might even say pleased. He examined the watch, held it to his ear, checked it against our regulator clock, and pronounced himself satisfied. He paid his account, thanked me, and left. There was nothing in his bearing to suggest a man in fear of his life. Did he seem hurried, anxious to be elsewhere? Not in the least. He lingered, if anything. He asked after a display piece in the window, a repeater by Dent, and we discussed its merits for a minute or two. It was the conversation of a man with time on his hands, Mr. Holmes, not a man rushing to an appointment." Holmes thanked him, and we stepped back into the street. I expected him to make for the spot where the disappearance had occurred, but instead he stood quite still on the pavement outside the shop, his hands clasped behind his back, and gazed at the passing traffic with an expression of deep concentration. "What do you make of that, Watson?" "That Carroway was unaware of any danger, that whatever happened to him came without warning." "That is one reading," Holmes said. "There is another." "Which is?" "That he was not awaiting danger at all, that he was awaiting something else entirely, something he had arranged, something whose timing pleased him. A man who lingers in a watchmaker's shop, admiring clocks, checking the hour, and pronouncing himself satisfied. That is not the portrait of a victim, Watson. That is the portrait of a man keeping to a schedule." I confess the remark struck me as premature. We had not yet examined the scene, but Holmes was already moving and I followed. The spot where Alfred Carroway had last been seen occupied a stretch of pavement on the western side of Regent Street, approximately 40 yards south of the watchmaker's door. Flagstones, a curbstone, the iron railing of a basement area. The morning's foot traffic had already begun to obscure whatever traces remained, and a constable stationed at the corner regarded us with the weary suspicion of a man who had been asked too many questions by too many journalists. Holmes produced his card. The constable's expression changed at once. "Mr. Holmes, sir. Inspector Lestrade said you might come. He asks that you call upon him at the yard when you've finished." "I shall do nothing of the kind until I have finished here. Watson, stand at the curb and observe." I did as instructed. Holmes dropped into a crouch upon the pavement and began to move along the flagstones with the slow, systematic intensity of a man reading a manuscript written in a language only he could decipher. His lens appeared in his hand. He bent so low that his nose was scarcely 6 inches from the stone. He moved a pace, stopped, moved again, stopped. Then he became very still. "Come here, Watson. Tell me what you see." I knelt beside him. He was pointing at the pavement near the base of the iron railing, close to where the curbstone met the building line. I saw, at first, nothing remarkable, only the general grime of a busy London street. But Holmes directed my attention to a circular mark upon the stone, approximately 18 inches in diameter. It was faint but distinct, a ring of dark residue, sooty and greased, with a cleaner centre where something had stood. "A brazier," I said. "The chestnut vendor's brazier." "Precisely. And what does the mark tell you?" "That his cart stood here." "More than that. This is not the mark of a cart pushed about and repositioned during a busy afternoon. This ring is clean-edged even, and deep. The brazier stood in this exact position for hours, Watson. It was placed here with the deliberateness of a chess piece, and it did not move until the game was over." He shifted his lens to the left, toward a seam in the flagstones where two large paving slabs met. Here I could see, now that he had directed my attention, a series of fine, bright scratches in the stone, fresh marks that had not yet been darkened by weather or the passage of feet. "These are hinge marks," Holmes said quietly. "Something with iron fittings has been opened and closed here, and recently. The scratches are sharp, unworn, and run in a short arc consistent with the swing of a heavy hatch or trapdoor set into the pavement." I stared at the marks. A cellar entrance? Almost certainly. These older buildings along Regent Street were constructed with pavement hatches for the delivery of goods directly into the basement storerooms. Most are bricked up or permanently sealed. This one, it appears, was not. He rose to his feet, dusted his knees, and inhaled deeply through his nose, then again, more slowly, turning his head as though tracking a current in the air. "Watson, do you smell that?" I breathed in. Beneath the general London miasma of hoarse coal smoke and damp stone, there was something else. Something warm, sweet, and faintly scorched, and it took me a moment to place it. "Chestnuts," I said. "Roasted chestnuts." "Precisely, and roasted chestnuts sold from a mobile cart at 2:30 yesterday afternoon should not still perfume this stretch of pavement at 9 o'clock the following morning. Not unless the vendor occupied this spot for a very considerable period. Hours, not minutes, long enough for the oils and the smoke to season the stone itself." He stood in silence for a moment, his gaze moving from the soot ring to the hinge scratches and then upward, along the line of the street, tracing the path a heavy vehicle would take as it passed. "Now, the carriage grooves." He crossed to the road surface and knelt again at the edge of the curb. "Here, deep wheel ruts from a heavy wagon, a delivery vehicle, fully laden, judging by the depth of the impression. It passed close to the pavement, between the vendor's position and the far side of the street. For several seconds, Watson, anyone standing on the opposite pavement, would have had their view of this precise spot entirely blocked." "A screen?" I said. "A screen," he agreed, "whether by accident or by design." He straightened and looked at me with an expression I knew well, the cool, contained excitement of a man who sees the shape of a mechanism before he understands its purpose. "Let us assemble what we have. A chestnut vendor who stations himself with military precision over a cellar hatch and remains there for hours. A hatch that has been recently opened. A delivery wagon that passes at the critical moment, blocking the line of sight. And a man who vanishes from this exact spot as cleanly as if the pavement had swallowed him." "Then you believe Carroway was seized, pulled down through the hatch by someone waiting below?" "I believe Carroway went through that hatch, Watson. The question is whether he went down struggling or stepping, and on that point I note one curious absence." He swept his hand across the flagstones. "Where are the marks of a scuffle? If a man of Carroway's size was seized and hauled downward through a hole in the pavement, there would be some trace of resistance, a hat knocked loose, a scratch of boot leather upon stone. And yet the pavement is clean. The constable confirms that nothing was found. Perhaps the vendor cleared it away. Perhaps. Or perhaps there was nothing to clear." He turned toward the adjacent shop front. "This building, Hargrove and Sons, perfumers. Their cellar lies directly beneath the hatch. I intend to see it before the day is out. But first, Watson, the witnesses. Lestrade has taken statements, no doubt, and will share them grudgingly. I, however, prefer to conduct my own interviews. We spent the better part of an hour speaking to shopkeepers and passers-by who had been on the street the previous afternoon. Their accounts were broadly consistent and broadly useless, as witness accounts so often are. Several ladies recalled seeing a well-dressed gentleman outside the watchmaker's. 2 remembered the chestnut vendor. One elderly gentleman was certain he had heard a cry. Another, standing 3 paces from him, was equally certain he had not. None had seen Carroway actually disappear. The wagon had passed and he was gone. Holmes listened to each account with scrupulous patience, asked few questions and made no notes. I knew from long experience that the notes were being made internally, filed and cross-referenced with a speed no written record could match. It was only as we turned back toward Baker Street that he spoke again. "Mechanical, yes," he said, almost to himself. The method is certainly mechanical. A trapdoor, a screen, a timing. It has the neatness of a stage illusion. But here is what troubles me, Watson. Panic leaves its own debris. Fear is clumsy. A man who is ambushed, seized, and dragged underground by force does not vanish cleanly. He leaves traces of shock, of resistance, of the body's involuntary rebellion against violence. And I do not yet see any of those traces. "What do you see?" Holmes flagged a passing hansom and opened the door for me. As I climbed in, he paused upon the step and looked back along Regent Street, now filling with the midday crowd, the gas lamps beginning to dim against the brightening haze. "I see precision," he said. "I see preparation. I see an operation conducted with the calm of a man winding a clock. And that, Watson, is what does not yet fit, because kidnapping is not calm. Kidnapping is violent, desperate, and necessarily improvised, no matter how carefully it is planned. This was something else, something rehearsed." He stepped into the cab and pulled the door shut. "Tomorrow we shall visit the cellar, and then, I think, the firm of Carroway and Weatherby, where the real questions may lie. For I am increasingly persuaded that the mystery of Regent Street is not how Alfred Carroway vanished. But why? Chapter 3. The boy who saw him turn. The afternoon of that same Friday found us once more upon Regent Street, though the character of our inquiry had shifted. The morning had been given to stone and ash, the mute testimony of the pavement itself. Now Holmes wished to hear from the living, and in particular from those witnesses whose accounts had not yet been filtered through the heavy sieve of Inspector Lestrade's questions. "The police interview with a purpose already fixed," Holmes remarked as we walked. "They seek confirmation, I seek contradiction." Lestrade had furnished us with his usual mixture of cooperation and resentment, a list of 11 persons who had given statements regarding the disappearance. Holmes dismissed 7 of them at a glance. 2 society ladies who saw nothing but wished to be involved. A clerk who was inside a shop and heard the commotion afterward. 3 gentlemen whose accounts are identical in every particular, which means they have compared stories and are now collectively useless. And a policeman who arrived after the fact. That leaves 4 worth speaking to, and of those 4, only 2 interest me. The first was a tobacconist named Jessup, who kept a shop on the eastern side of the street, and had been standing in his doorway smoking a cigarette at the relevant hour. He was a large, slow-spoken man with stained fingers and the watchful eyes of a tradesman who spends his days observing foot traffic. "I saw the gentleman right enough," Jessup said. "Tall fellow, good coat, standing outside Whitmore and Crane. He had something in his hand, a watch, I think, and he was looking at it. Then another man came up to him. Dark coat, bowler hat, foreign-looking, or perhaps not foreign, but something about him that wasn't quite ordinary. They spoke for a moment, very brief, and then the foreign-looking man moved off." "In which direction?" "South, toward Piccadilly, walking normally, not hurried." "And Carroway? After this exchange?" Jessup frowned. That's when I lost sight of him. The brewery wagon came through. Big thing, 4 horses, and it blocked my view entirely. When it passed, he was gone. I thought he'd stepped into a shop. It wasn't until the shouting started 10 minutes later that I realised anything was wrong. Holmes pressed him on the man in the dark coat. Height, build, age, indistinguishing marks, but Jessup could add little beyond what he had already said. The man was of middling height, clean-shaven, and moved with a certain quickness that Jessup described, after some thought, as theatrical. Theatrical, Holmes repeated. An interesting choice of word. Thank you, Mr. Jessup. The second witness was the one Holmes had truly come to find. His name was Tommy Briggs, and he was a newspaper boy of perhaps 12 or 13 years, sharp-featured and quick-eyed, who sold evening editions from a pitch near the corner of Beak Street. He had been working his way south along the western pavement, the same side as Carroway, when the disappearance occurred. We found him at his usual spot, a thin figure in a cloth cap and a jacket 2 sizes too large, though calling out headlines with the practised hoarseness of a boy who has been shouting since dawn. Holmes bought a paper, then a second, and then leaned against the lamp-post beside the boy with the easy manner he could adopt when he wished to put a witness at ease. "You were here yesterday afternoon, Tommy?" The boy regarded him with the frank suspicion of a child who has learned that adult interest in his observations usually precedes trouble. "Who's asking?" "My name is Holmes. I'm looking into the disappearance of the gentleman outside the watchmaker's." "I already told the copper everything." "I have no doubt you did, but coppers ask one sort of question, and I ask another. You were walking south along this pavement. You saw the gentleman with the watch." "I saw him, yeah. Standing there plain as anything. Nice coat. And he was looking at his watch like it was made of gold, which I suppose it was. Did you see the man who spoke to him? Dark coat, bowler hat?" "I saw him. He came up, said something quiet, couldn't hear what, and then walked off. The gentleman watched him go." And then Tommy hesitated, and it was in that hesitation that Holmes found what he had come for. "Go on." "Well, it's just, the copper didn't think much of it when I said, but the gentleman, after the other man walked away, he didn't stay where he was. He moved. Not far, just a few steps. But he walked toward the chestnut cart, deliberate-like, not wandering. He looked at the cart, and then he sort of stepped close to it. And that's when the wagon came through and I couldn't see any more." Holmes was very still. "You're certain he moved toward the cart? Not away from it? Not along the pavement, but toward the chestnut vendor's position?" "Certain as I'm standing here. He turned and walked right to it, 3 or 4 steps, like he meant to." "Did the vendor do anything? Speak to him? Reach for him?" Tommy shook his head. "I couldn't see that well. The cart was between me and them, sort of. But the gentleman walked to the cart on his own. Nobody pushed him. Nobody pulled him." Holmes gave the boy a half-crown, which was received with wide eyes and a grin. As we walked away, I could see from the set of Holmes's jaw that the testimony had struck home. "You see the significance, Watson. The man in the black coat directed him, told him where to go, perhaps under threat. That is one possibility. But consider the boy's precise words. The gentleman walked to the cart on his own, not under compulsion, not with the jerky haste of a man obeying a whispered threat. Tommy Briggs described a man moving with purpose, deliberately, calmly, as though keeping an appointment. You cannot build a theory on the impressions of a 13-year-old boy. I can build a question on them, which is more valuable at this stage than any theory. The question is this: why would Alfred Carroway, of his own volition, walk toward the exact spot from which he was about to vanish? I had no answer for that, and Holmes did not press the point. Instead, he turned our attention to a matter that had been nagging at the edges of the investigation since the previous evening. "There is a woman," he said, Lestrade's report mentions that a Miss Lydia Marston was identified among the passers-by on Regent Street at approximately the time of the disappearance. She is described as a former actress, the Lyric Theatre, and is known to have been an intimate acquaintance of Alfred Carroway. Lestrade considers her peripheral. I do not. We found Miss Marston at her residence in Mayfair, a handsomely furnished first-floor flat in a quiet street off Berkeley Square, the sort of address that speaks of a woman who has learned to live well on the generosity of others without advertising the arrangement. A maid admitted us after some negotiation, and we were shown into a drawing-room decorated with theatrical prints, fresh flowers, and the kind of tasteful restraint that costs a great deal of money to achieve. Lydia Marston herself was a woman of 30 or 31, dark-haired, fine-boned, with large, intelligent eyes and the particular quality of self-possession that I have noticed in women who have spent years on the stage. She was dressed simply but well, and she received us with a composure that seemed natural rather than forced, the composure of a woman who is accustomed to being looked at and has long since ceased to be discomfited by it. "Mr. Holmes," she said, extending her hand, "I wondered when you would come. The papers say you have been engaged." "Then the papers, for once, are accurate. You were on Regent Street yesterday afternoon, Miss Marston." "I was. I had been shopping, Dickens and Jones, the department store, which is a short walk from Whitmore and Crane. I was looking for gloves. I heard the commotion perhaps 20 minutes after it occurred and learned, along with half the street, that a gentleman had vanished." "You knew Alfred Carroway personally?" A faint pause. "I did. We were acquainted socially some time ago." "How long ago?" "The acquaintance ended, the better part of a year, perhaps 10 months." "And the nature of this acquaintance?" Her eyes held his without flinching. "We were friends, Mr. Holmes, close friends. I will not pretend otherwise. You would see through the pretence, and I have been told you dislike wasted time." "I do. Were you aware that Carroway would be on Regent Street yesterday?" "I was not. The coincidence is unfortunate but genuine. I shop on Regent Street with some regularity. Our London is not so large that one cannot encounter an acquaintance by chance." Holmes regarded her for a moment with that penetrating grey stare that has unsettled far more hardened subjects than Lydia Marston. She bore it well. But I noticed, and I am certain Holmes noticed, a very slight stiffening of her posture, a barely perceptible tightening of the fingers laced in her lap. "One further question, Miss Marston. Are you presently acquainted with anyone associated with the Lyric Theatre? Performers, stagehands, management?" The answer came a fraction too quickly. "No, I left the theatre 2 years ago. I have had no meaningful contact with anyone there since." Holmes rose, thanked her with impeccable courtesy, and we departed. In the cab he sat in silence for several minutes before speaking. "She is lying. Watson." "About the theatre?" "About the theatre." The denial was rehearsed, smooth, immediate, and entirely devoid of the natural hesitation one employs when genuinely searching one's memory. She had that answer ready before I asked the question, which means she anticipated it, which means there is a connection she wishes to conceal. "You think she is involved in Carroway's disappearance?" "I think she is concealing a connection between Carroway and the world of the theatre, and the world of the theatre is precisely where this case keeps pointing. The vendor's precision, the sightline management, the trapdoor mechanics. It has the bones of a stage illusion, Watson. And now we have an actress who is present at the scene and lies about her theatrical connections. I felt the pieces beginning to arrange themselves in my mind, not yet a picture, but the outline of one. Then you suspect Lydia Marston of arranging the disappearance? Perhaps in concert with Weatherby, the business partner, who also has cause to wish Carroway gone. I suspect everyone and no one, which is the only honest position at this juncture. But I will tell you what interests me most, Watson. It is not Miss Marston's lie. Liars are common. It is the boy's testimony. A man who walks toward his own vanishing point, that is uncommon. That is the detail that does not yet belong to any theory I can construct, and it is therefore the detail most likely to belong to the truth. He tapped his stick against the floor of the cab. Tomorrow I wish to see what lies beneath that hatch. Whatever carried Alfred Carroway away from Regent Street did not carry him into the air. It carried him underground. And underground, Watson, is where I expect we shall find our answers. Or, at the very least, our next question. Chapter 4. Beneath the Perfumery. The cellar entrance of Hargrove and Sons, perfumers, was reached not through the shop itself, whose proprietor, a Mr. Gerald Hargrove, received us with the anxious hospitality of a man who fears that association with a sensational crime may either ruin his business or improve it beyond all recognition, but through a service door in the narrow lane that ran behind the Regent Street frontage. Holmes had obtained a warrant through Lestrade, though I suspect he would have proceeded without one. The pavement hatch is on the street side, Holmes explained as we descended a flight of worn stone steps into a corridor that smelled powerfully of a tar of roses, sandalwood, and the chemical sweetness of synthetic violet. But the cellar extends beneath the full footprint of the building and connects, I believe, to a network of storage corridors that once served the entire block. Mr. Hargrove, when were these lower passages last in regular use? Hargrove, who had insisted on accompanying us, despite an evident discomfort with enclosed spaces, mopped his forehead with a silk handkerchief. Not in my time, Mr. Holmes. My father sealed the connecting door when he took the lease in 72. The cellar itself we use for stock, crates of soap, perfume bottles, that sort of thing, but the passages beyond have been shut up for 20 years or more. And the pavement hatch? We received no deliveries through it. It hasn't been opened in, well, I couldn't say, years. It was always more trouble than it was worth. The mechanism is stiff, and the pavement crowds make it impractical. And yet, Holmes said, it has been opened, recently, and with considerable ease. We had reached the cellar proper, a low, vaulted space lit by a single gas jet that Hargrove turned up with a trembling hand. The air was thick and still. Crates and boxes lined the walls in orderly rows, and the flagstone floor was covered with a fine layer of dust that had been undisturbed for months, except in one area. And directly beneath the pavement hatch, which was visible above us as a rectangular iron frame set into the ceiling, its outline marked by hairline cracks of grey daylight, the dust had been violently disrupted. A space, roughly 6 feet square, had been cleared, and in its centre lay a stack of heavy-grained sacks, 4 deep, arranged in a rough square. Holmes examined the sacks without touching them. Hessian, he said. Standard dock-issue grain sacks, the sort one can purchase by the dozen at any warehouse in Limehouse or Rotherhithe. They have been placed here deliberately, stacked to form a cushion approximately 3 feet high. A man dropping through that hatch would fall 6 feet and land upon these with no worse injury than a bruised knee. A landing pad, I said. Precisely, and not improvised. These sacks were brought here in advance, carried down through the service entrance and arranged with care. Someone prepared this cellar to receive a falling body, or rather, a stepping one. He turned his attention to the hatch mechanism itself. Standing upon one of the packing crates, he was able to reach the iron frame and examine its hinges with his lens. I watched his face as he worked, the total absorption, the slight movements of the lips as he catalogued observations to himself. The hinges have been oiled, he announced, recently and liberally. The original ironwork is old, 50 years at least, but someone has cleaned the pivot points, applied machine oil of good quality, and worked the mechanism back and forth until it operates smoothly. A hatch that Mr. Hargrove tells us has not been opened in years now moves with the ease of a well-maintained door. This was not the work of 5 minutes, Watson. Whoever prepared this entrance visited the cellar more than once. He dropped down from the crate and moved to the far wall, where a heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar. It had been sealed, as Hargrove had said, with a length of timber nailed across the frame, but the nails had been drawn, the timber set aside, and the door forced open. Beyond it lay darkness. "Mr. Hargrove, I shall trouble you for a lantern, and then, with your permission, Dr. Watson and I will proceed alone." Hargrove was only too happy to comply. He produced a bull's-eye lantern from a shelf, lit it, and retreated up the stairs with visible relief. Holmes took the lantern, adjusted its beam to a narrow focus, and pushed the door fully open. The passage beyond was unlike anything I had expected. I had imagined a crude tunnel, the sort of rough-dug earth corridor one associates with smugglers or sewer workers. Instead, we found ourselves in a brick-vaulted commercial corridor, perhaps 7 feet high and 4 feet wide, its walls lined with the remnants of gas fittings and the ghostly outlines of painted signs. The air was cold, damp, and utterly still, carrying the faintest echo of our footsteps back to us from some indeterminate distance ahead. "A merchant corridor," Holmes said, sweeping the lantern beam along the ceiling. "These were built in the 40s and 50s to allow goods to be moved between the basements of adjacent buildings without troubling the street above. Most have been sealed or incorporated into newer foundations, and this one appears to have been forgotten entirely, which made it, for our purposes, an ideal highway." He lowered the lantern to the floor and dropped into a crouch. "Now, Watson, come here and tell me what you see." I knelt beside him. The dust on the corridor floor was thick and grey, and through it ran 2 distinct sets of footprints, both heading in the same direction, away from the cellar and deeper into the passage. Holmes traced the first set with the tip of his finger, hovering a 1/4 inch above the surface. This print is made by a well-constructed city shoe. Leather sole, narrow welt, recent manufacture. The stride is long and even. The weight distribution is consistent throughout. Heel strike, ball, toe, with no stumbling, no dragging, no lateral deviation. This is the walk of a man moving quickly but confidently through a space he has traversed before. He shifted the lantern to the second set, and this, a heavier boot, working man's footwear. The stride is shorter, the impression deeper. He was either a heavier man or carrying something. He too walked with confidence, no hesitation at the turnings. I studied the prints. 2 men then, Carroway and his abductor, moving through the passage. 2 men, certainly, but examine the prints more closely, Watson. Where is the evidence of compulsion? I looked again. The footprints ran side by side in places, one ahead of the other in others, but always in the same steady, purposeful rhythm. There were no scuff marks, no places where the finer shoe had twisted or dragged, as one would expect of a man being forced along against his will, and no points where the heavier boot had stopped to pull, to shove, to wrestle a resistant captive forward. "A man who is dragged through a tunnel leaves a very particular signature," Holmes said quietly. "The toe drags, the heel catches, the stride becomes irregular, punctuated by the jerks and stumbles of a body in rebellion. There are marks on the walls where shoulders collide with brick. There are places where the captor must brace and haul. This passage shows none of that. These 2 men walked together, Watson, side by side at a steady pace, through a route they both knew. Then they forced him along at knife point, perhaps, a weapon held close, a whispered threat. Perhaps, and yet a man walking at knife point still carries fear in his body. The stride shortens, the steps become tentative, the foot hesitates before each turning, because the mind does not know what lies ahead, and the body flinches from the unknown. These footprints do not hesitate. They move through this corridor with the certainty of a man walking through his own house. He straightened and held the lantern high. The corridor stretched ahead, curving gently to the left, its brickwork darkened by decades of damp. At the far edge of the lantern's reach, I could see the passage branch, one arm continuing straight, the other turning sharply right. Shall we follow? Not today. The passage is long, and I wish to trace its full extent with proper preparation, but I have seen enough to form the essential picture. He turned to me, and in the yellow lamplight his face held an expression I'd come to know well, the taut, contained energy of a mind that has assembled the mechanism of a crime but has not yet identified its architect. The physical method is clear, Watson. A man descends through an oiled trapdoor onto prepared sacks. A chestnut vendor operates the hatch above, timed to coincide with the passage of a heavy wagon that blocks the witness's sight lines. The man drops into a cellar, passes through a forgotten commercial corridor, and emerges, somewhere. The theatre district, I suspect, given the direction of travel. The execution is flawless. The timing is exquisite. The preparation is weeks in the making. Then we are dealing with a sophisticated criminal organization. We are dealing with sophistication, certainly. But I'm not yet convinced we are dealing with criminals in the plural sense you mean. He paused at the doorway back into the Hargrove cellar and looked once more at the footprints on the corridor floor, the fine city shoe and the heavy working boot, walking side by side into the dark. There is a question that has been forming in my mind since yesterday, Watson, and it will not be silenced. Every element of this disappearance speaks of cooperation. The vendor cooperates, the timing cooperates, the mechanism cooperates, the victim's own behavior cooperates. He is calm before the event, he walks toward the cart, and he descends through a passage without leaving a single mark of resistance. Everything cooperates, and when everything in a crime cooperates, one must ask whether the supposed victim is truly a victim at all, or whether he too is part of the conspiracy. I stared at him. You cannot mean that Carroway arranged his own disappearance. I mean nothing yet. I observe only that this passage received a traveller, Watson, not a burden. A man who knew where he was going, who had walked the route before, and who went willingly into the dark. Whether that man was Alfred Carroway, and why he might have chosen to vanish from the most public street in London, are questions I cannot answer until I have examined the world he left behind. He extinguished the lantern, and we climbed the stairs back into the daylight, such as it was. The fog had thickened again, and Regent Street moved past us in its eternal river of commerce and fashion, utterly indifferent to the secret corridor that ran beneath its flagstones like a vein beneath the skin. "Tomorrow," Holmes said, pulling on his gloves, "we turn from the method to the motive. I wish to examine the firm of Carroway and Weatherby. I wish to understand the dead man's finances, his partnerships, and his enemies. And I wish to speak again with the one person who may know more than she has yet admitted. Miss Marston? Miss Marston lies about the theatre. Weatherby, the partner, lies about his movements. Somewhere between those two lies, Watson, there is a truth, and I intend to find it before Lestrade arrests the wrong man, which he is at present on the very brink of doing." Chapter 5. The Partner with Too Many Secrets. The offices of Carroway and Weatherby Investments occupied the second and third floors of a handsome stone building on Threadneedle Street, within sight of the Bank of England. It was the sort of address that speaks of solidity, reputation, and the quiet accumulation of other people's money, qualities that, as I was beginning to suspect, may have been more ornamental than structural in the present case. We arrived on Saturday morning, the 16th of November. Holmes had spent the previous evening in a state of intense but uncommunicative thought, smoking 3 pipes in succession and responding to my attempts at conversation with monosyllables. I had learned, over the years, that this behaviour indicated not discourtesy but the final stages of a mental sorting process. the arrangement of facts into provisional hierarchies of significance, each one tested, weighed, and either elevated or discarded. By morning he was brisk, purposeful, and dressed with unusual care, as though preparing for a social engagement rather than an interrogation. "Finance," he remarked in the cab, "is the one field in which I have always felt my education to be deficient. I can read a bloodstain or a tobacco ash with confidence, but a balance sheet is a grimmer adversary. Fortunately, I do not need to understand every entry, only the ones that have been altered." Inspector Lestrade met us at the building's entrance. He was in high spirits, which in Lestrade's case invariably meant he had formed a theory and was eager to have it confirmed. "I've been through the firm's correspondence, Mr. Holmes. There are things here that want explaining. Weatherby's been hiding something. I'd stake my pension on it." "Your pension, Lestrade, is safe from me. Let us see what Mr. Weatherby has to say for himself." Charles Weatherby received us in Carroway's own office, a fact that Holmes noted with a glance but did not remark upon. Weatherby was a man of 54, with the carefully maintained appearance of a city professional. Silver hair, a well-cut morning coat, a watch chain of restrained elegance. But beneath that polished surface the man was visibly strained. His colour was poor. His hands moved too often, adjusting his cuffs, touching his collar, aligning objects on the desk that required no alignment. He rose when we entered, and remained standing, as though sitting would concede some advantage he could not afford to lose. "Gentlemen, I am, of course, entirely at your disposal. This business with Alfred, it has been a terrible shock. Terrible." "No doubt," said Holmes. "Pray sit down, Mr. Weatherby. I shall not keep you long. I wish only to clarify certain points regarding your movements on Thursday afternoon." A flicker of something, not quite fear but its near cousin, crossed Weatherby's face. He sat. "I was at my club, the Reform, from early afternoon onward. I lunched there, read the papers, and remained until I received word of Alfred's disappearance at approximately 4:30. "At what hour did you arrive at the club?" "Shortly after 1:00. "I should say." Holmes regarded him with the patient stillness of a cat watching a mousehole. "The club's porter, Mr. Weatherby, records arrivals in a book. According to Inspector Lestrade's inquiry, you signed in at 25 minutes past 2. That is nearly 90 minutes later than you have just stated." Weatherby's hands went to his cuffs again. "I may have been mistaken about the exact time. One loses track in the course of a busy day." "One does not lose track of 90 minutes, Mr. Weatherby. Where were you between 1:00 and 25 past 2 on Thursday?" The silence that followed was of the kind I have come to recognize in the course of Holmes's investigations. The silence of a man calculating whether the truth will cost him more or less than the lie he has already told. Weatherby's eyes moved from Holmes to Lestrade to me and back again, and in them I saw not the cold resolve of a guilty man, but the panicked arithmetic of a man who has been caught in a deception and cannot see his way out. I had a meeting, a private meeting. It has no bearing on Alfred's disappearance. Everything has bearing until I determine otherwise. With whom did you meet? Another silence. Then, with the air of a man laying down a losing hand. With representatives of Cavendish and Sons and the banking house. We met at their offices on Lombard Street. The meeting concluded at approximately 2:00, after which I walked to the Reform Club. And the subject of this meeting? It was a preliminary discussion regarding the possible acquisition of this firm. Even Lestrade, who is not a man easily surprised by the machinations of the wealthy, raised an eyebrow. "You were selling the firm, without your partner's knowledge?" "It was exploratory only. Nothing had been agreed. Alfred would not have entertained the idea. He considered the firm his legacy. But our financial position has been difficult. My wife's illness has placed considerable strain upon my personal resources, and the firm itself has not performed as well in recent quarters as one might wish. I believe that a discreet approach to Cavendish might open a path to saving yourself, Holmes said without malice. Weatherby flinched. To saving the firm. And yes, to saving myself. I am not proud of the secrecy, but I did not harm Alfred. I had no reason to. If he is alive, the firm continues. If he is dead, he stopped, as though hearing his own words for the first time. If he is dead, Holmes completed, you inherit control of the firm and may sell it at will, which gives you, Mr. Weatherby, both motive and opportunity. I did not do this. Then you will not object to my examining certain documents. Holmes had already moved to the desk and was sorting through a stack of correspondence with the swift, practised eye of a man who knows what he is looking for without yet knowing what it looks like. Within minutes, he had extracted 2 items. The first was a confidential memorandum in Weatherby's own hand, filed among the firm's private papers. It read, in part, "The matter must be settled before December. Further delay is neither practical nor advisable, and I have taken steps to ensure that the transition proceeds without unnecessary disruption." Watson leaned over my shoulder and read it. I saw his jaw tighten. "That memorandum," Weatherby said quickly, "refers to the Cavendish negotiations. The December deadline is their requirement, not mine. They wish to complete any acquisition before the end of the financial year." "A convenient explanation," Lestrade said, and I could hear in his voice the satisfaction of a man whose theory has been confirmed. The second document was not Weatherby's. It was a letter addressed to Alfred Carroway, received at the firm approximately 2 weeks before the disappearance. It had been opened, read and filed, not destroyed, which struck me as odd for a letter of its contents. It read, "You will answer for what you have done, and I shall see to it personally. The truth is not buried so deep that it cannot be dug up, and I have the shovel. P.H. Asterisk. Peter Haldane," Weatherby said, before Holmes could ask. "A former clerk. Alfred dismissed him 3 months ago for irregularities in the accounts. The man took it badly, threatened legal action, wrote letters, made something of a nuisance of himself. Alfred regarded him as beneath concern." "And you?" Holmes asked. "How did you regard him?" "As a bitter young man with a grievance and no means of pursuing it. Haldane was dismissed for cause. His threats were empty, the bluster of a man who knows he has been beaten." Holmes pocketed the letter without comment. He spent another 20 minutes examining the firm's ledgers, asking occasional questions about specific entries that appeared to puzzle him. I noticed that Weatherby answered these financial questions with greater confidence than he had shown regarding his movements. He was on familiar ground, and his explanations were clear and detailed. But twice Holmes paused at a particular page, ran his finger along a column of figures, and said nothing. We left the offices shortly before noon. Lestrade walked with us as far as the corner, where he stopped and turned to Holmes with the expression of a man who has been patient long enough. "Well, Mr. Holmes, Weatherby has motive, opportunity, and he lied about his whereabouts. The memorandum speaks for itself. And this Haldane, a dismissed clerk with a threatening letter and a grudge. Between the two of them, I'd say we have our answer." "You would say that, Lestrade, because you are looking at the shape of the puzzle and believing it complete. I am looking at the gaps." "What gaps?" "Weatherby is frightened, Lestrade. Did you not see it? He is frightened of scandal, of exposure, of the ruin of his reputation. But he is not relieved. A man who has successfully arranged the disappearance of his business partner, who has cleared the path to his own salvation, should show some sign of relief beneath the anxiety, some flicker of the burden lifted. Weatherby shows none. He's not a man who has solved his problem. He's a man whose problem has become worse." Lestrade frowned. "That's thin, Mr. Holmes." "It is a thread, and the threads, when followed, sometimes led to cloth. He hailed a cab. I have 2 more calls to make today. The first is to the lodgings of Peter Haldane, the author of that extraordinary letter. The second, he paused with one foot on the step. I shall keep to myself for the moment. Watson, you are welcome to accompany me to Haldane's. After that, I may need to work alone. In the cab, I said what I'd been thinking since we left Threadneedle Street. Holmes, the case against Weatherby is strong. The secret negotiations, the memorandum, the timing of his meeting, the lie about the club. Even the threatening letter from Haldane could be read as part of a larger picture. A man already under pressure from a dismissed employee, seeing his partner's removal as the only way out. It could be read that way, Holmes agreed. Watson's theory, as always, has the virtue of neatness, but neatness is the enemy of truth in criminal investigation. The real world is not neat. It is full of men with secrets that have nothing to do with the crime at hand, and women with lies that conceal sins far smaller than murder. Weatherby is hiding a betrayal, the secret sale of a partnership. That is shabby, not homicidal. Haldane is hiding a grievance, the dismissal that ruined him. That is bitter, not deadly. Then what are you hiding, Holmes? He smiled, that thin, private smile that meant he was pleased with the shape of his own thoughts, but not yet ready to share them. A suspicion, Watson. Nothing more. A suspicion that the man we are all looking for, the villain of this piece, the architect of Alfred Carroway's impossible disappearance, may be someone we have not yet considered, or rather, someone we have considered only in one light and not yet turned to see from another angle. He said nothing more until we reached Haldane's lodgings in Clerkenwell, and by then my mind was already racing ahead to theories I could not yet articulate, but could feel gathering at the edges of comprehension like storm clouds on a distant hill. Chapter 6. The Actress Who Lied. Holmes had disappeared for several hours on Saturday afternoon, while I was attending to a patient at my practice. When he returned to Baker Street shortly before 5 o'clock, he was in a state of contained agitation that I recognized at once. The restless energy of a man who has found something significant but has not yet determined its full meaning. His trouser cuffs were damp and grey with dust. His fingertips were smudged with chalk, and he carried, wrapped in his handkerchief, 2 small objects which he laid upon the table without ceremony. I went back underground, Watson, through the Hargrove cellar and into the passage. I followed it to its full extent, or nearly so. The corridor runs roughly northwest beneath the block, passing through 3 bricked archways and a turning that is marked, interestingly, with a chalk arrow on the wall. Someone has been through this route recently and has left navigational marks for himself or for a companion. And these? I indicated the objects on the table. Holmes unwrapped the handkerchief. The first item was a small, ragged scrap of fabric, plum-coloured, with a soft, dense nap. Even in the lamplight its quality was evident. This was no workman's cloth. Velvet, Holmes said. Theatrical velvet. To be precise, the variety used for costume linings, curtain backings, and the interior finishes of stage wardrobes. I found it caught upon a nail approximately 200 yards into the passage, at a point where the corridor narrows, and a man moving quickly might brush against the wall. The nail has torn it from a garment, an overcoat lining, I should think, given the weight and weave. A theatrical costume, or a garment made by a theatrical costumier. The distinction is important. This is not cheap stage cloth. It is high-quality velvet of a deep plum colour. The sort of lining a wealthy man might commission for a bespoke overcoat from a costumier who also serves private clients. I have encountered such work before. While certain costumiers in the theatre district maintain a discreet trade in private commissions, masquerade costumes, fancy dress pieces, and overcoats with dramatic linings for gentlemen who enjoy a touch of the theatrical in their personal wardrobe. He set the velvet aside and turned to the second object. It was a theatre programme, Small, cheaply printed, damp with cellar moisture, but still legible. I read the cover. The Lyric Theatre presents The Hidden Passage, a melodrama in 3 acts, by arrangement with the Shaftesbury Theatre Company. Found on the corridor floor, Holmes said, approximately 30 yards beyond the velvet scrap. It bears a thumb smudge of white stage chalk on the inner page, the same chalk I found marking the turning points of the route. I examined the programme. The play itself, and according to the brief description within, concerned a nobleman who conceals his identity, moves through secret passages within a country house, and is ultimately unmasked through a piece of evidence left accidentally behind. The irony was not lost on me. "The Lyric Theatre," I said. "That is where Lydia Marston performed." "It is, and the programme confirms what the physical evidence has been suggesting since the beginning. This route connects Regent Street to the theatre district. The chalk, the programme, the velvet, all point towards someone with intimate knowledge of stage mechanics, theatrical materials, and the lyric theatre in particular." He dropped into his chair and pressed his fingertips together beneath his chin. "Which brings us, Watson, to the matter of Miss Marston. I interviewed her once and found her evasive. I intend to interview her again this evening, and this time I shall not be so easily deflected." We arrived at Lydia Marston's Mayfair flat shortly after 7 o'clock. The maid who admitted us was the same girl as before, but her manner had changed. She was nervous, hesitant, and glanced back over her shoulder as she led us to the drawing-room. Lydia herself was waiting for us, standing rather than seated, dressed in a dark gown that gave her the appearance of a woman preparing for a performance she had not chosen to give. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. I confess I did not expect a second visit so soon." "Investigations move at their own pace, Miss Marston. I have a few additional questions, if you will permit." "Of course." She sat, arranging herself in the armchair with the practised grace of a woman who understands the power of composure. But she was sharper than before, more guarded, more deliberate. I had the impression of watching an actress who had studied her lines overnight and was now determined to deliver them without error. Holmes, however, was not interested in her lines. He was interested in the room. He had positioned himself near the fireplace, apparently warming his hands. But his gaze, I noticed, had fallen upon the grate, where a small fire burned low. Among the embers lay the charred remains of a piece of paper, not fully consumed, but curled and blackened, with fragments of handwriting still visible along one edge. Holmes bent, as though adjusting the fire screen, and in a single fluid movement retrieved the largest fragment with his fingertips. Lydia did not see him do it. I did. "Miss Marston," Holmes said, straightening and turning to face her with the fragment concealed in his palm. "When we last spoke, you told me that your acquaintance with Alfred Carroway had ended some 10 months ago. I would like to revisit that point." "I told you the truth. Did you?" Holmes opened his hand. The fragment of paper lay across his palm, scorched, brittle, but bearing in a strong masculine hand the words, "Cannot continue to meet under these conditions. The risk to us both is now considerable, and I must ask that you—" Lydia's composure did not shatter, but it fractured. A fine line appeared between her brows, her lips pressed together. "That letter," she said, very quietly, "is private correspondence. It is evidence, Miss Marston. Evidence that your relationship with Alfred Carroway did not end 10 months ago. This letter is recent. The ink is dark. The paper is of a type currently sold by Smithson of Bond Street, and the phrasing suggests an ongoing arrangement, not a concluded one. You have been burning it because you anticipated precisely this inquiry." She was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had lost its theatrical projection and become smaller, harder, and more honest. "Very well. The affair did not end when I said, It continued until quite recently, a matter of weeks. Alfred wished to end it. He was agitated, distracted. He said the circumstances had changed and that he could not afford the risk any longer. I did not know what he meant by the risk. I assumed he meant his wife had discovered us. And you burn the letter because it proves I lied to you, and because it proves the affair, and because I have my own reputation to consider, such as it is. There was a bleak humour in her voice. I am not a respectable woman, Mr. Holmes, but I am a careful one, or I was, until this week. Holmes let the silence hold for a beat. Then he moved to the mantelpiece, where a row of small framed photographs stood in a neat line. One of them, the second from the left, was turned face down. Holmes righted it without asking permission. The photograph showed a man of perhaps 40, dark-haired, with a strong jaw and a faintly theatrical bearing. He wore a well-cut waistcoat and held in one hand a top hat. Yeah, there was something in his posture, a showman's confidence, a performer's awareness of the lens, that set him apart from the ordinary studio portrait. "And who is this gentleman, Miss Marston?" She looked at the photograph as though it were a door she had hoped would remain shut. "His name is Rinaldo Marchetti. He is a stage illusionist. He performs at the Lyric Theatre." "And your connection to him?" "He is a friend." "A close friend?" "Yes." "How close?" The pause that followed was the longest of the evening. I watched Lydia Marston's face and saw in it the particular anguish of a woman who has built an elaborate structure of concealment and feels it beginning to give way beneath her. "He is my husband," she said. "We were married in Rome 3 years ago. The marriage is not publicly known. It would have been inconvenient for both of us." Holmes nodded, as though this were merely the confirmation of something he had already suspected. An actress who has left the stage and lives on the patronage of wealthy admirers cannot afford to be known as a married woman, and an illusionist who works in the theatre cannot afford to be known as the husband of a woman associated with wealthy men. The concealment served you both. "Yes." "And Marchetti, does he know Alfred Carroway?" "Aye, they may have met. I cannot say with certainty." "Cannot, or will not?" She said nothing. Holmes gathered his hat and stick. At the doorway he turned and regarded her with an expression that was neither harsh nor sympathetic, but something more unsettling, the expression of a man who sees the truth taking shape and does not yet know whether to pity or condemn what it will reveal. "Miss Marston, I will offer you one piece of counsel. The time for careful lies has passed. When I return, and I shall return, I will ask you questions to which I already know the answers. I suggest you be prepared to match them." In the cab, I could contain myself no longer. Holmes, the picture is becoming clear. Lydia connects Carroway to Marchetti, an illusionist, a man who designs vanishing acts for a living. The velvet, the programme, the chalk, they all point to a theatrical professional. Lydia arranged for Marchetti to make Carroway disappear, perhaps at Weatherby's request, perhaps on her own initiative out of jealousy or revenge. That is a perfectly constructed theory, Watson. It has motive, means, and opportunity, and it connects every suspect in a satisfying chain. You disagree? I observe that Miss Marston lies with economy, Watson. That is the dangerous sort. She admits only what she must, conceals what she can, and never volunteers more than the question demands. But there is a difference between a woman who lies to protect a conspiracy and a woman who lies to protect herself. Every lie she has told tonight can be explained by vanity, shame, and the instinct for self-preservation. Not one of them requires criminal intent. And the photograph? The marriage? The marriage is significant. It connects the theatre world to Carroway's intimate circle, and it explains how a stage illusionist might have been recruited for a task requiring theatrical expertise. but it does not tell us who did the recruiting. He leaned back in the cab and closed his eyes. The route is real, Watson. The artifice is real. The question that remains is the oldest in crime. Who benefits most from the illusion? Tomorrow I shall trace that passage to its end, and I expect to find at the far side of it the theatre where the trick was designed and the man who designed it. After that, the answer will be very close. Chapter 7. Through the Wings of London. On Sunday morning, Holmes and I descended once more into the cellar of Hargrove and Sons, equipped this time with 2 bull's-eye lanterns, a ball of twine, a pocket compass, and a small leather case of tools whose specific purposes Holmes did not explain. And the fog had lifted overnight, and a pale winter sun illuminated Regent Street above us. But within moments of passing through the broken door at the rear of the cellar, we had left the daylight behind entirely. The passage was, as I remembered it, brick-vaulted, cold and still, but Holmes moved through it now with the brisk familiarity of a man retracing a route he had already surveyed. He paid no attention to the footprints and the grain sacks, which he had examined to his satisfaction the previous day, and instead pressed forward to the point where the corridor branched. "Left continues beneath the buildings of Glasshouse Street," he said, consulting his compass. "Right turns northwest toward Shaftesbury Avenue and the theatre district. The chalk arrows, you see them here. And here, direct the traveller to the right." We followed the right-hand branch. The passage narrowed, then widened again into what had once been a storage vault of considerable size, its walls lined with empty shelving and the rusted remains of iron hooks. Holmes swept his lantern across the floor and paused. 2 sets of prints again, the fine shoe and the heavy boot walking together, but here a 3rd set. He crouched and indicated a series of impressions that were distinct from the other 2. A medium-weight shoe with a smooth sole and a slightly turned-out right foot. This man walked the route at a different time. The prints overlay the others in places and are overlaid in others. He came through here on at least 2 occasions. Once before the disappearance, once on the day itself. A reconnaissance, followed by execution. 3 men, then. 3 men who used this passage. Whether all 3 were present simultaneously is another question. We pressed on. The corridor turned twice more, each turning marked with a chalk arrow on the right-hand wall. At the second turning, Holmes stopped and raised his lantern to illuminate a low archway where the brickwork changed character. Older, darker, with the rounded profile of early Victorian construction. "We are passing beneath Shaftesbury Avenue now," he said. "The theatre district is directly above us. Listen." I held my breath. From somewhere overhead, faint and muffled, came the rhythmic thud of hammering, the unmistakable sound of stage hands at work, building or dismantling a set. "Close," I whispered. "Very close." The passage ended, not in a wall, but in a wooden door, heavy, iron-banded, and fitted with a lock that had been recently forced. Beyond it lay a steep flight of stone steps ascending into darkness. Holmes took them 2 at a time, and I followed, my hand on the revolver in my coat pocket. At the top of the stairs we emerged into a low-ceilinged basement room, cluttered with the debris of theatrical production. Stacked flats painted with forest scenes and drawing-room interiors, a rack of dusty costumes, coils of rope, buckets of sizing, and the sharp mineral smell of scene paint. A single gas jet burned in a wall bracket, casting long shadows across the confusion. "The basement of the Lyric Theatre," Holmes announced, with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose deductions have been confirmed by geography. The understage area, specifically, below the trap room and the fly gallery. This is where the scenery is stored between productions and where the mechanical apparatus for stage effects is maintained. It is also conveniently where a man might change his clothing without being observed. He moved to a large wicker trunk standing against the far wall, the sort of container used to collect costume donations and discarded wardrobe pieces. The lid was unfastened. Holmes raised it and examined the contents with his lantern. "Workman's clothing," he said, lifting out a rough canvas jacket, a cloth cap, and a pair of heavy boots. "Recently placed here. The fabric is clean, not dusty, and has not been compressed by the weight of other garments. It was laid on top, ready to be taken up at a moment's notice." He held the jacket to his nose and inhaled. Then he held it out to me. "What do you smell, Watson?" I took the jacket and breathed in. Beneath the coarse smell of new canvas there was something else, something faint but distinct, a scent I had encountered before, though I could not immediately place it. "Cologne," I said. "An expensive cologne. Bergamot and sandalwood, if I am not mistaken." "You are not mistaken, and you have smelled it before. Or rather, you have been told of it. Mrs. Carroway, in her statement to Lestrade, described her husband's habitual cologne as a bespoke blend of bergamot, sandalwood, and a trace of ambergris, commissioned from a perfumer in Jermyn Street. That scent, Watson, is now upon a workman's jacket hidden in the basement of a theatre." The implication was staggering. Then Carroway was here. He came through the passage, changed his clothing in this room, and walked out disguised as a workman. That is what the evidence suggests. The fine city shoes walked through the corridor. The cologne is upon the disguise. The clothing was prepared in advance and placed here ready for use. The question, the only question that now matters, is whether Alfred Carroway placed it here himself, or whether it was placed here for him by someone who intended to spirit him away. He replaced the jacket and closed the trunk. "Come, Watson. There is a man upstairs whom I very much wish to meet." We ascended through a service staircase and emerged into the wings of the Lyric Theatre itself. The stage was partially lit, a rehearsal of some kind was in progress, and the sound of voices declaiming reached us from beyond the proscenium. Holmes moved through the backstage area with the assurance of a man who has spent time in theatres before, navigating the maze of ropes, pulleys, and painted flats until he found what he was looking for, a door marked "Stage Manager," beside which stood a notice board pinned with call sheets and production schedules. Holmes examined the notice board briefly, then knocked. The door was opened by a stagehand who directed us further along the corridor to a small dressing room at the rear of the building. The name on the door was painted in florid script, "Rinaldo the Magnificent." The man who answered our knock was not what I'd expected. I'd imagined a sinister figure, gaunt perhaps, with dark eyes and an air of menace. Instead, I found a man of approximately 40, solidly built, with olive skin, a broad, handsome face, and the restless energy of a born performer. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows, and his forearms were dusted with white powder. His hands, large, dexterous, expressive, bore unmistakable traces of stage chalk in the creases of his fingers and beneath his nails. "Signor Marchetti," Holmes said, "my name is Sherlock Holmes." The effect of that name was immediate and visible. Marchetti's face, which had been open and inquiring, underwent a rapid transformation. The colour receded, the smile fixed itself into something rigid, and the eyes, which had been bright with performer's charm, became watchful. "Mr. Holmes? Yes, I have read of you." "Then you will know that I do not make social calls. I am investigating the disappearance of Alfred Carroway from Regent Street. I believe you may be able to assist me." "I?" Marchetti spread his hands, a gesture that was both theatrical and defensive. "I know nothing of this matter. I am an entertainer, Mr. Holmes. I make rabbits disappear, not gentlemen." "And yet a programme from your theatre was found in an underground passage connecting Regent Street to this building, a passage through which a man walked on Thursday afternoon and emerged into the basement below your stage, a passage marked with the same chalk that is presently upon your hands." Marchetti's composure, such as it was, collapsed entirely. He sat down on the edge of his dressing table, knocking a tin of grease paint to the floor, and stared at Holmes with the expression of a man who has been found out and knows it. You're mistaken, sir." "I'm not mistaken." "And you are a poor liar, Signor Marchetti, which is surprising in a man whose profession is deception. Your hands bear chalk. Your black overcoat, that one hanging on the hook behind you, matches the description given by 3 witnesses of the man who spoke to Alfred Carroway moments before his disappearance. And your wife, yes, I know about the marriage, was Carroway's intimate companion. The threads converge upon you, sir. I suggest you consider very carefully what you wish to say next." Marchetti's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a precipice, trying to calculate whether the fall would kill him or merely break his legs. I will not." He stopped, drew a breath, ran his chalk-dusted fingers through his hair. "Mr. Holmes, I beg you to understand. I was given to believe that the affair was a private matter, a gentleman's difficulty. I was asked to design a technical effect, an illusion, nothing more. I did not know it would become this." "Who asked you?" "I cannot say." "Cannot, or will not?" "I am afraid, Mr. Holmes." And for the first time the performer's mask fell away entirely, and what remained was a frightened man in over his depth and sinking. "I was told it was a game, a private spectacle. I did not know anyone would be harmed." Holmes regarded him for a long moment. Then, without raising his voice, he said, "No one has been harmed yet, Signor Marchetti, but a man is missing, and Scotland Yard believes he has been murdered. If you wish to avoid being charged as an accessory to that murder, I suggest you prepare yourself to tell me everything. Not today, but soon. I will return, and when I do, I will not ask. I will tell you what happened, and you will confirm it." We left the theatre through the loading dock on Glasshouse Street. The same exit, I realised, that Carroway must have used in his workman's disguise. The street was busy with Sunday traffic, and no one glanced twice at 2 gentlemen emerging from a theatre's service entrance. Holmes walked in silence for some time. I expected triumph, the exhilaration of a chase nearing its end. Instead, his expression was contemplative, almost troubled. "We are very close, Watson." "Then why do you not seem pleased?" He stopped at the corner and looked back at the theatre's facade, the gilded letters, the playbills, the ornate lamps flanking the entrance. "Because Marchetti is frightened, and his fear is genuine. He is not the architect of this scheme, Watson. He is the engineer, hired, paid, and now terrified that the structure he built is going to fall on him. The architect is someone else, someone who understood Marchetti's skills, who knew the underground route, who could plan a vanishing act with the precision of a stage performance and the motive of a criminal." "Weatherby," I said. "It must be Weatherby." Holmes shook his head slowly. "I am no longer sure of that. There is one more thread to follow, Watson. One more question that, once answered, will unravel the entire tapestry. Tomorrow I shall pull it, and I think you will find, when the cloth falls apart, that the pattern was quite different from the one we have been reading. Chapter 8, The Victim Who Prepared His Own Flight. I have set down many of Holmes's cases in these pages, and in doing so I have frequently described the moment when the shape of the truth first becomes visible, when the fog of contradictory evidence parts, and the outline of the real crime stands clear against the light. In most cases, that moment arrives gradually through the slow accumulation of deductions. In the case of Alfred Carroway's disappearance, it arrived all at once on a Saturday afternoon in Baker Street, and it struck me with the force of a physical blow. But I am getting ahead of myself. The morning began with a visit to the Carroway residence in Kensington, a handsome villa in a quiet crescent, and its curtains half drawn in the manner of a household that has not yet decided whether it is in mourning. Mrs. Carroway received us with the same controlled composure she had displayed at Baker Street, though I noticed that the effort required to maintain it had become visibly greater. There were shadows beneath her eyes that had not been there 2 days earlier. Holmes asked to see her husband's private study. She led us upstairs without objection and left us alone, closing the door behind her with a soft click that carried to my ear a note of exhausted resignation. The study was a well-appointed room, mahogany desk, leather chairs, bookshelves lined with financial journals and legal reference works. A globe stood in one corner. The desk was orderly, its surface clear save for a blotter, an inkstand, as and a small brass letter rack containing a handful of recent correspondence. It was the room of a man who valued control, precision, and the appearance of calm authority. Holmes went to work at once. He examined the desk drawers. Most were unlocked, their contents unremarkable, and then turned his attention to the wastebasket, which had been emptied but not thoroughly. From the bottom he extracted 2 small items, a ball of crumpled paper and a torn fragment of pasteboard. He smoothed the paper first. It was a page torn from a Bradshaw's railway guide, and upon it, in pencil, someone had circled 3 departure times, all for the evening Dover Express from Victoria Station. The dates circled corresponded to the Saturday and Sunday following the disappearance. Carroway's hand? Holmes asked Mrs. Carroway, who had returned to offer tea. She glanced at the paper. Yes, that is Alfred's pencil mark. He always used a particular cross-stroke on his 7s. Holmes thanked her and turned to the second item, the torn fragment of pasteboard. It was small, perhaps 2 inches by 1, and bore a printed serial number and the partially visible words, Victoria Station, left lug, number 4471, November 11th. A left luggage receipt, Holmes said, dated 3 days before the disappearance, issued at Victoria Station. The ticket has been torn, deliberately I should say, since the tear runs through the middle of the serial number, rendering it difficult to trace at a glance. But the number is recoverable, 4471. He placed both items in his pocket and turned to the bookshelves. For several minutes he examined the spines of the volumes, pulling out one here, another there, flipping through pages with rapid precision. From behind a row of law reports he extracted a slim leather notebook that had been concealed, not hidden with great ingenuity, but placed where a casual searcher would not think to look. The notebook contained, in Carroway's hand, a series of entries that meant little to me. Names of shipping companies, departure schedules for vessels bound for South America, and a list of costs, hotel rates in Buenos Aires, passage fares, and the notation living expenses. First year, approximately £3,200. Holmes closed the notebook and said nothing, but his expression, that particular tightness around the eyes that I had learned to read as the sign of a hypothesis confirmed, told me that he had found what he had come looking for. We left the Carroway residence and took a cab directly to Clerkenwell, where Peter Haldane occupied a pair of rented rooms above a chandler's shop. The contrast with the Kensington villa could not have been starker. The staircase was narrow and unlit. The door, when it opened, revealed a room that was clean but bare, a table, a chair, a narrow bed, a shelf of books, and the particular desolation of a man who has known better circumstances and has not yet made peace with his reduced ones. Haldane himself was a surprise. I had expected the author of that threatening letter to be a figure of some menace, coarse perhaps, or wild-eyed with grievance. Instead I found a young man of 27, thin, pale, neatly dressed in clothes that had been good once and were now carefully maintained. His eyes were intelligent and wary. His manner, when he understood who we were, was neither hostile nor servile but cautious, the manner of a man who has been burned and does not intend to be burned again. I have been expecting someone, he said, though I imagined it would be the police, not you, Mr. Holmes. The police may follow. That depends largely on what you tell me now. I have read your letter to Alfred Carroway. You will answer for what you have done. I shall see to it personally. Those are strong words, Mr. Haldane. They were meant to be, but not in the way you are thinking. He sat down at the table and folded his hands before him, the hands of a clerk, ink-stained and precise. I did not threaten his life, Mr. Holmes. I threatened his reputation. There is a difference. Though I grant you the letter does not make it plain. Explain. I was a senior accounts clerk at Carroway and Weatherby for 4 years. I was good at my work. I was trusted with access to the primary ledgers. And 5 months ago, I noticed something wrong. What did you notice? Entries that did not correspond to real transactions. Payments recorded to overseas investment entities that I could find no trace of in any commercial register. Transfers to accounts in Zurich and Buenos Aires that appeared to exist solely on paper. The sums were not large individually, a few hundred here, a few hundred there, but they were systematic, and over time they added up to something very considerable indeed. Holmes leaned forward. And you brought this to Carroway's attention. The bitterness that crossed Haldane's face was not performative. It was the real and enduring bitterness of a man who had done the right thing and been destroyed for it. I brought it to him privately. I showed him the entries. I expected shock, or at least concern. Instead, I received something far worse. He was calm. Perfectly calm. He thanked me for my diligence, told me he would look into the matter, and asked me to keep it between us. 2 weeks later, I was dismissed for gross misconduct, falsification of accounts. He had altered the records to make it appear that I was the one responsible for the discrepancies. My references were destroyed. My name was blackened in the city. No respectable firm would touch me. And the threatening letter was my promise to expose him, not to harm him, to ruin him as he had ruined me. I have evidence, Mr. Holmes, not much, but enough. From beneath a loose floorboard, a hiding place that spoke eloquently of the depth of his fear, Haldane produced a single sheet of ledger paper, folded and worn at the creases. It was a page copied in his own hand from the firm's books, showing a sequence of transfers to an entity called the Compañía de Investimentos do Atlántico Sul. Beside each entry, Haldane had noted the corresponding absence of any confirming documentation. "This company does not exist," he said. "I searched every registry I could access. It is a fiction, a vessel for moving money out of client accounts and into Carroway's private control." Holmes examined the page in silence for a long time. Then he said, "How much, in your estimation?" £40,000 at least, perhaps more. I had access to only a portion of the records before I was dismissed. "And the audit?" Haldane's eyes widened. "You know about the audit?" "I know that an independent review of the firm's accounts was scheduled." "When?" 10 days from the date of his disappearance. The investors had begun to ask questions. Carroway could not delay it further. Holmes rose, shook Haldane's hand, a gesture that surprised the young man visibly, and said, "You have been treated abominably, Mr. Haldane. I cannot undo what has been done to you, but I can assure you that the truth, when it emerges, will include your vindication." In the cab back to Baker Street, Holmes was silent. But it was a different silence from the brooding concentration of previous days. It was the silence of a man who has completed a long and difficult calculation and is now contemplating the answer. At Baker Street he stood before the fireplace and laid out upon the mantelpiece the items he had collected over the course of the investigation: the velvet scrap, the theatre programme, the left luggage fragment, the railway guide page, the ledger leaf, and his own notes. He arranged them in a line, as one might arrange the movements of a symphony, and then he turned to me. "Watson, I owe you an apology." "An apology?" I have allowed you to pursue a theory that I knew to be wrong, not out of cruelty, but because I needed to be certain of my own before I dismantled yours. I am now certain." He pointed to the evidence on the mantelpiece, touching each item as he spoke. Alfred Carroway was calm on the day of his disappearance. Not the calm of ignorance, but the calm of preparation. He moved toward the chestnut cart of his own volition. He descended through the trapdoor without resistance. He walked the underground passage in a well-made city shoe, side by side with his accomplice, at a steady pace, without a single mark of struggle. He changed clothing in the basement of a theatre and walked out disguised as a workman. He had prepared a valise at Victoria Station 3 days in advance, containing money and travel documents. He had studied departure times for the Dover Express. He had planned a new life in South America, down to the cost of his first year's living expenses. And he had overwhelming motive: £47,000 in embezzled funds and an audit 10 days away that would expose every penny of it. He paused. The fire crackled. The evening traffic of Baker Street rumbled distantly below. "We have been seeking the villain who carried off Alfred Carroway. But no one carried him off, Watson. Alfred Carroway departed under his own arrangements." I stared at him. The mantelpiece evidence stared back. Each item, I now realized, pointing not to an abductor but to an architect. "He did not vanish from Regent Street," Holmes said quietly. "He descended from it and into the role he had written for himself." Chapter 9. Platform 4. Holmes moved quickly after the revelation. Within the hour he had dispatched 3 telegrams, one to Lestrade at Scotland Yard, one to an address in the East End that he did not share with me, and one to Victoria Station's left luggage office requesting that item number 4471 be held under no circumstances to be released. He then changed into a suit of older, less conspicuous clothing and asked Mrs. Hudson for strong coffee and cold beef, which he consumed standing at the mantelpiece with the focused indifference of a man fueling a machine. "He will try tonight," Holmes said. "The Saturday evening Dover Express. He has been waiting 2 days in some cheap room near the station, under a false name, watching the platforms and gauging whether the initial frenzy has cooled sufficiently for him to move. He is a man of schedules, Watson. He will not deviate from the timetable he set for himself unless he is forced to, and nothing, as yet, has forced him." "You are certain he has not already gone?" "Reasonably certain. The police presence at the major terminals on Thursday evening and Friday was heavy, Lestrade's doing, and for once useful. Carroway would have seen uniformed officers at Victoria and judged it too dangerous to attempt immediate departure. He is patient. He will have waited. But he cannot wait indefinitely. Every day he remains in London increases the risk of discovery, and the audit clock is still running. No, tonight is the night. He will have calculated it to the hour." At 6:30, Lestrade arrived at Baker Street, accompanied by 2 plainclothes constables. He was in a state of considerable agitation, part professional excitement, part wounded pride at having spent 3 days pursuing a kidnapping theory that had now been comprehensively dismantled. "You might have told me sooner, Mr. Holmes." "I might have told you wrongly, Lestrade. I preferred to wait until I could tell you correctly. The plan is simple. Carroway will attempt to board the 8:40 Dover Express from Victoria. He will be disguised, a workman's jacket, cloth cap, false beard. He will be carrying a valise collected from the left luggage office. I want your men positioned at the platform gates, the left luggage counter, and the station's main exits. No uniforms, no sudden movements. We are catching a fox, not storming a barricade." "And you, Mr. Holmes?" "I shall be on the platform." We reached Victoria Station shortly before 8 o'clock. The great terminus was in its evening state of controlled pandemonium, the vast iron and glass roof trapping the mingled vapours of 100 locomotives, the platforms thronging with passengers, porters, newsboys, and the inevitable confusion of a Saturday departure. The fog had crept in from the streets and hung in pale scarves among the iron pillars, softening the gas lamps into amber smudges and lending the entire scene a quality of theatrical unreality that struck me, under the circumstances, as grimly appropriate. Holmes had changed his appearance with a few deft touches: a porter's cap borrowed from a station employee, a heavy muffler wound about his neck, and a slight alteration to his posture that rounded his shoulders and shortened his stride. He moved through the crowd with the unhurried purposefulness of a man who belonged there, pausing to consult a timetable board, adjusting a luggage trolley, exchanging a word with a guard. I, positioned near the bookstall with a newspaper held before my face, could barely distinguish him from the genuine staff. It was a reminder, one of many I had received over the years, that Holmes's gifts extended well beyond the intellectual. He was, when the occasion demanded, as fine an actor as any who had trod the boards of the lyric theatre. The minutes passed. The 8:40 departure was announced. Passengers began moving toward platform 4, funneling through the gate in a stream of overcoats, hat brims and luggage. I watched them pass and felt my heart beating with an urgency that seemed disproportionate to the stillness of my body. Somewhere in this crowd, if Holmes was right, a man who had deceived all London was preparing to walk calmly out of his old life and into a new one. At 20 minutes past 8, I saw him. He came from the direction of the left luggage office, walking at an unhurried pace, carrying a brown leather valise in his right hand. He wore a rough canvas jacket of the sort a labourer might own, a cloth cap pulled low over his forehead, and heavy working boots. A thick, dark beard covered his jaw and chin. To a casual observer, he was unremarkable, one more working man among thousands, catching a cheap evening train. But his walk betrayed him. Not to an ordinary eye. The disguise was good, the posture carefully altered. But to anyone who had spent days studying the movements and habits of Alfred Carroway, there was something in the precision of his stride, the measured placement of each foot, the controlled economy of a man who had spent a lifetime cultivating the appearance of unruffled authority. He walked like a man who was accustomed to being watched and had merely changed the costume in which he performed. Holmes saw him at the same moment I did. I know this because I saw Holmes straighten, a barely perceptible correction of posture, like a hound catching a scent, and begin to move along the platform on a converging path. Carroway reached the gate of platform 4. He produced a ticket, purchased in advance no doubt under his assumed name, and passed through. He walked along the platform toward the third-class carriages at the rear of the train, the valise held close to his body. The locomotive hissed and sighed. Steam rose in white plumes that mingled with the fog. A guard's whistle shrieked somewhere down the line. Holmes fell into step beside him. For a moment they walked together, the disguised detective and the disguised fugitive, like two strangers sharing a platform. Then Holmes spoke. His voice was quiet, conversational, and perfectly audible above the ambient noise of the station. "You kept admirable time, Mr. Carroway, until the final connection." The effect was extraordinary. Carroway's stride did not falter. It stopped. He froze in place, as completely and suddenly as if every mechanism within him had seized at once. For one instant he stood motionless, the valise gripped in his whitened fist, the fog swirling about his boots. Then his head turned very slowly and he looked at Holmes. I could not see his expression from where I stood, but I saw his body, the rigid line of his shoulders, the locked knees, the absolute stillness of a man whose elaborate machinery of control has encountered, for the first time, an obstacle it cannot process. Then he ran. He dropped the valise and bolted, not toward the train, but sideways, vaulting the low railing that separated platform 4 from the adjacent bay. He was fast. Even in the heavy boots and the encumbering jacket, he moved with the desperate, graceless speed of an animal that has been flushed from cover. He landed hard on the neighbouring platform, stumbled, regained his footing, and sprinted toward the far exit. Holmes did not run. He raised one hand, a single unhurried gesture, and Lestrade's constables, who had been positioned with admirable discretion near the exits, closed in from 3 directions. Carroway saw them too late. He checked his stride, turned, and found a 3rd officer behind him. For a moment he spun in place like a compass needle seeking north, and then a 4th constable, a large and decisive young man, caught him about the waist and brought him down onto the platform with a force that knocked the false beard loose and sent it skittering across the flagstones like a dead animal. The struggle was brief. Carroway fought, not with skill, but with the blind, convulsive energy of a man for whom surrender is unthinkable, and was subdued within seconds. Lestrade was upon him at once, and the handcuffs closed with a sound that carried across the platform like the snap of a lock. I reached the scene in time to see them haul him to his feet. Without the beard, his face was exposed, pale, drawn, unshaven beneath the false hair, and bearing an expression I shall not soon forget. It was not fear exactly, nor rage, nor despair. It was bewilderment, the absolute bewilderment of a man who has calculated every variable, accounted for every contingency, and been defeated by a factor he had not considered. "How?" he said. His voice was hoarse. He was looking at Holmes. Holmes picked up the valise, which had burst open upon the platform. Its contents were strewn across the flagstones: bundles of banknotes bound with paper bands, a packet of forged travel documents, a railway guide with annotations in Carroway's hand, a change of clothing, and the Breguet pocket watch, the very watch he had collected from Whitmore and Crane on the afternoon of his disappearance. Holmes gathered the watch and held it up, turning it so that the enamelled dial caught the gaslight. "Because your disappearance was too exact, Mr. Carroway," he said. "A kidnapping is rough, a murder is hasty, but your vanishing was perfect, timed to the second, executed without a single misplaced step. It was precise, controlled, and vain. It was, in short, the work of a man who worships his own cleverness. And that worship was the flaw." He placed the watch upon the pile of scattered evidence. "Violence is clumsy, Mr. Carroway. Vanity is precise, and precision, in a crime that is supposed to look like chaos, is the surest signature an investigator could wish for." Carroway said nothing. He stood between the constables with his wrists bound and his disguise in ruins, and for the first time since the investigation had begun, I saw the man behind the mask. Not the composed financier, not the meticulous schemer, but a man who had gambled everything on the perfection of his own plan and lost. Lestrade cautioned him and led him away. The scattered banknotes were gathered, the valise closed, and the evidence taken into custody. Passengers who had stopped to stare were ushered onward by station staff, and within minutes the platform had returned to its ordinary Saturday evening rhythm, as though nothing of consequence had occurred. Holmes stood where he was, watching the departing train pull out of Platform 4 and gather speed into the foggy darkness toward Dover, the train that Alfred Carroway would never board. "Greaves?" I asked. "Taken this afternoon, in lodgings in Whitechapel. He was hiding under a bed when the officers arrived. He wept, Watson. He believed he was being arrested for murder." "And Marchetti?" "Confronted with the evidence this morning and made a full statement. He maintains, and I believe him, that he was told the vanishing act was a private spectacle designed to humiliate a blackmailer. He is a fool, but not a villain." I stood beside him on the platform as the last wisps of steam dissolved into the fog. The station settled into its late evening quiet. A few porters, a sweeper, the distant clang of a signal. "It is over then," I said. "Nearly," Holmes replied. "There remains the matter of explanation, of reassembling the pieces for those who have been watching the wrong puzzle. Tomorrow, I think, at Baker Street, with a fire, and perhaps a glass of something, and the satisfaction of having prevented a man from escaping the consequences of his own precise and selfish cruelty." He turned up his collar, and walked toward the exit, and I followed, as I have always followed, into the cold London night. Chapter 10. The Measure of a Man. It was Sunday morning, the 17th of November, and Baker Street had the particular stillness that descends upon London when the church bells are finished and the city draws breath before the week begins again. The fire was well built, the curtains drawn back to admit a pale wash of winter sunlight, and Mrs. Hudson had laid out a breakfast of considerable generosity: eggs, toast, devilled kidneys, and a pot of coffee strong enough, as Holmes once remarked, to dissolve a confession from a stone. Inspector Lestrade arrived at 10:30, looking rumpled and somewhat chastened, but carrying, to his credit, the bearing of a man who has accepted his error and wishes only to understand it. He settled into the basket chair with a cup of coffee and a silence that, for Lestrade, was unusually receptive. Holmes stood at the mantelpiece, where the evidence of the Carroway case remained arrayed in the order he had laid it out the previous evening: the soot sample, the velvet scrap, the theatre programme, the left luggage fragment, the railway guide page, the ledger leaf, and his own notes. He had the manner of a lecturer preparing to address a small and attentive class, and I recognised, with the warmth of long familiarity, the particular pleasure he took in the final reconstruction, the moment when chaos is revealed to have been order all along. "Let us begin," he said, "with what we believed and why we believed it wrongly." He touched the soot sample. On Friday morning, I examined the pavement outside Whitmore and Crane and found three things: the soot ring left by a chestnut brazier that had occupied a fixed position for hours, the hinge scratches of a pavement hatch that had been recently opened, and the lingering scent of roasted chestnuts, far stronger than any passing vendor would produce. These clues told me that the physical mechanism of the disappearance involved a trapdoor, a fixed obstruction to conceal it, and a timing that exploited the passage of a heavy wagon to block the witnesses' sight lines. Right, the method was clear from the first morning. What was not clear, and what led us all astray, was the question of who had designed the method and for whose benefit. He moved to the velvet scrap. The underground passage yielded two further clues: this fragment of plum-coloured theatrical velvet, torn from the lining of an expensive overcoat made by a theatrical costumier, and a programme from the Lyric Theatre, bearing a thumb smudge of stage chalk. Together they pointed toward the world of the theatre, toward performers, illusionists, and the mechanics of stage deception. The natural assumption, and it was the assumption every one of us made, Watson, for including myself for a time, was that these clues indicated a conspiracy, that someone had hired a theatrical professional to abduct Alfred Carroway. And the natural candidate for that someone, Lestrade said, was Weatherby. Just so. Charles Weatherby had motive, financial desperation, and the prospect of controlling the firm. He had opportunity, an alibi with a 35-minute gap. He had a compromising memorandum in his papers, and he had lied about his movements. The case against him was tidy, plausible, and entirely wrong. Holmes set the memorandum on the table. Weatherby's memorandum, "The matter must be settled before December," referred not to Carroway's removal, but to the legal timetable for selling the firm to Cavendish and Sons. His secret meeting on Thursday was with bankers, not conspirators. His lies were the lies of a man ashamed of betraying his partner's trust, not of a man who had arranged his partner's disappearance. Weatherby was compromised, not murderous. His sin was disloyalty, not violence. He took up Haldane's threatening letter. Peter Haldane, the dismissed clerk, wrote these words: "You will answer for what you have done. I shall see to it personally." In the context of a disappearance suspected to be a kidnapping, the letter reads as a death threat. In the context of what Haldane actually knew, that Carroway had been systematically embezzling client funds and had destroyed Haldane's career to conceal the theft, it reads as what it was: the promise of a wronged man to seek justice through exposure. Haldane threatened Carroway's reputation, not his life. He was the only honest man in the affair, and he was the one most thoroughly punished for it. He turned to the photograph of Marchetti. Lydia Marston lied to us twice, once about the duration of her affair with Carroway, and once about her connection to the Lyric Theatre and to Rinaldo Marchetti. Both lies were motivated not by criminal involvement, but by the desire to protect her reputation and her marriage. She is a woman who has built a precarious life upon discretion, and when that discretion was threatened, she did what such women do. She burned the evidence and denied the connection. She is guilty of vanity and self-preservation. She is not guilty of conspiracy. And Marchetti himself? Lestrade asked. Marchetti is a craftsman who sold his skills without understanding what they would be used for. He was told by Carroway himself, nay, through intermediaries, that he was helping a wealthy gentleman stage a private vanishing act to humiliate a blackmailer. It was the sort of commission that appealed to Marchetti's professional pride and his financial need in equal measure. He designed the sightline interruption, the trapdoor timing, and the underground route. He conducted rehearsals. He made the final confirmation on the street, in his black coat and bowler hat, moments before the disappearance was executed. He is the man the witnesses called Mr. Blackwood, the sinister stranger who was, in truth, merely a stage technician checking his cues. And the vendor? I asked. Greaves? Tobias Greaves is a former dock worker with a petty criminal record, hired through underworld intermediaries to operate the chestnut cart and open the hatch at the designated moment. He understood nothing of the larger plan. He was paid in cash, told when to arrive, what to do, and when to leave. When the affair became a sensation and the word murder began appearing in the evening papers, he fled to Whitechapel and hid. He is guilty of being a hired pair of hands. He is not guilty of foresight. Holmes paused and turned to face us, and his expression had changed. The intellectual pleasure of the reconstruction had given way to something quieter and more reflective, the particular gravity that came upon him when a case touched not merely upon ingenuity but upon character. Which leaves us, he said, with Alfred Carroway, the supposed victim, and the man all London believed had been abducted or murdered in broad daylight on the most fashionable street in the city. He moved to the ledger leaf and the left luggage fragment. For 18 months, Carroway had been embezzling funds from his own clients through a network of fictitious overseas entities. The total exceeded £47,000. An independent audit was scheduled for 10 days after the disappearance, an audit that would have exposed every fraudulent entry in the books. Carroway faced imprisonment, professional disgrace, and the complete destruction of his family's reputation. He could not prevent the audit. He could not falsify the records further. He could not run, not openly, not as himself, not without attracting immediate suspicion. So he vanished, Lestrade said. He vanished. Or not privately, anyone can slip away in the night, but publicly, spectacularly, in the most theatrical, impossible manner he could devise, so that all London would believe him the victim of a kidnapping, or worse. While Scotland Yard hunted for an abductor, he would be crossing the Channel under a false name, bound for South America with £12,000 and the beginnings of a new identity. Holmes picked up the Breguet pocket watch, which had been returned to the evidence table along with the contents of the valise. The watch is the key to his character, Watson. He collected it on the afternoon of his disappearance, a fine timepiece, repaired to his exacting standards, examined and approved in the watchmaker's shop, with the calm satisfaction of a man who has everything in order. He then walked out onto Regent Street and executed his own disappearance with the timing of a clockwork mechanism. He had rehearsed the route, he had prepared the landing, he had placed his disguise, He had deposited his valise. Every element was timed, tested, and calibrated to the second. It was, I confess, a brilliant piece of work. "You almost sound as though you admire him," I said. "I admire the engineering. I do not admire the engineer." Holmes set the watch down. "Alfred Carroway was a man who worshipped timing, Watson. He trusted precision more than conscience, order more than honour. Such men can build fortunes, and when pressed, construct their own ruin with the same neat hands. His scheme was not the product of desperation. It was the product of vanity, the belief that he was cleverer than everyone around him, that he could choreograph reality itself, and that the world would perform according to his direction. That vanity was his strength and his undoing. A desperate man would have fled in the night and taken his chances. Carroway could not bear to flee without a performance." The room was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted and settled. From the street below came the distant sound of a church bell marking the quarter hour. "And Mrs. Carroway?" I asked. "Did she know?" Holmes considered this with care. She suspected financial disaster. I believe she had sensed it for months. The late nights in the study, the tension, the sleeplessness. She is an intelligent woman, and intelligent women who live with secretive men develop a particular instinct for the shape of trouble, even when they cannot see its specifics. But I do not believe she knew of the embezzlement, and I am certain she did not know of the disappearance plan. Her distress when she came to us was genuine. Her composure was the composure of a woman who has been bracing herself for catastrophe, without knowing what form it would take. "What will happen to her?" I asked. "That is beyond my jurisdiction, Watson. The law will deal with Carroway. Society will deal with his wife. I suspect the latter will be the harsher judge." Lestrade rose, shook Holmes's hand with more warmth than he customarily displayed, and departed with the evidence. At the door he paused and said, with a gruffness that did not entirely conceal a note of respect, "I'll say this for you, Mr. Holmes. You were right, and I was wrong, and the man is in custody. That's what matters." "What matters, Lestrade, is that Peter Haldane is vindicated. See to it that his name is cleared. He has earned that much." When Lestrade had gone, Holmes settled into his chair, lit his pipe, and gazed into the fire with the abstracted contentment of a man who has completed a difficult piece of work and is not yet ready to begin another. I sat opposite him, my notebook open on my knee, and attempted to organize the extraordinary events of the past 4 days into something approaching a coherent narrative. "You know, Watson," Holmes said after a long silence, "the most interesting feature of this case is not the mechanism, clever as it was, but the question it poses about the nature of disappearance itself. Carroway did not merely wish to leave, he wished to be believed gone, and he wished to create a story, a narrative of victimhood that would persist in his absence and shield him from pursuit. He was, in his way, an author. He wrote himself a role, cast his accomplices, staged his scene, and exited through the wings. The only thing he did not anticipate was a critic in the audience." I smiled at that. "And the critic's verdict?" "That the performance was technically accomplished but morally empty. A vanishing act requires the audience to wonder where the man has gone. It does not require them to care. And that, I think, is the measure of Alfred Carroway. He understood timing. He understood mechanics. He understood the geometry of sightlines and the psychology of misdirection. But he did not understand that the people he left behind, his wife, his partner, even the clerk he destroyed, were not stagehands in his private theatre. They were human beings, and they deserved better than a conjurer's exit." He drew on his pipe and blew a thin stream of smoke toward the ceiling. "But that, Watson, is a sermon, and I am not a clergyman. Write it up as you see fit. I believe the public will find it diverting." And so I have. The most sensational vanishing in London was no miracle at all. but a desperate escape engineered by the man whom all believed lost, a man who trusted his own precision above all things, and who learned too late that the most carefully wound clock may still be caught by a hand steadier than its own. The case was closed, the fire burned low, and Holmes, having restored order to one small corner of the world, reached for his violin and began to play, not the brooding minor-key passage of Thursday evening, but something lighter, warmer, and touched with the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved and a truth set free.